In this movie, we'll look at the properties palette. Properties are always available for any element that you create or select in a Revit project. Properties are very context sensitive, so depending on what you're doing, you're going to see very different things on the properties palette. So I'd like to look at a few different scenarios with you here. In a file called Condo Unit, and it's included with the exercise files, but you could follow along in any Revit project. There are two contexts under which you'll see the properties palette. One is when you're creating objects, and another is when you select something that already exists. So for example, if I came up here to the Architecture tab and click on the Wall tool, what you'll see is in addition to all the context-sensitive stuff that we covered in the previous movie about the ribbon tab and the options bar, if we look over here on the Properties palette, you will see various properties that are specific to the wall that I'm about to create. So at the very top, we have the Type selector, and you can see that this particular one is defaulting to a generic 8-inch wall, but if I open that up, it's a rather long list, and I could choose from many different kinds of walls that I could draw. Beneath that, I've got location line and what level I want to draw it on and the height and so forth. And if I started to draw, it would just simply draw objects using those settings. Now notice that while I'm in the midst of drawing, all of the settings are grayed out. So if I wanted to change the settings, I can do that, but I have to press Escape first to get back to kind of get out of the current drawing mode and get back to the properties. So I'm still in the command. I could make changes. For example, I could choose a different kind of wall and then pick up where I left off, and you'll see that the new wall is a little bit thinner than the other wall. So you can certainly interact with the properties as you're drawing, and we're going to get into a lot more of the specifics on drawing walls in a later movie. So don't worry too much about those specifics at this time. I want to focus mainly on the interaction with the properties palette at this time. So I'm going to cancel twice now, escape twice to get out of that command. And I'm actually going to focus my attention now on some of the objects that are already here in the model. For example, here at the exterior wall, if I click on that, with it selected, in addition to our Modify tab that we saw before, if we look at our Properties palette now, you're going to see much of the same stuff that we just saw when we were creating a new wall. Here at the Type selector, we've got the same choices, and I could open this list up, and I could actually even choose a completely different type of wall if I wanted to, like an exterior insulation finish system wall. The wall did get slightly thinner. I don't know if you noticed that or not. And if we were to look at it in another view, we would actually see that the finish material has actually changed. We could change the location line of the wall or the heights or constraints of the wall. Any of those settings we could change directly on the Properties palette. But let's do one that's a little bit more evident. For example, I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to double click on the south elevation to open that view up and zoom in just a touch. And I'm going to select this window right here. Now, if we look at the Properties palette, it tells me that this is a double casement window, and it's on level 1 with a sill height of 3 feet. Now, if I click right there, I can actually change that height directly here in the Properties palette. So it's just another example of making that kind of a modification. So if I put in 2 here and I press Enter, it doesn't appear like anything has actually taken place. Well, you have to actually apply the change. Revit allows you to make multiple changes on the Properties palette and then apply them all in one step. So you can do that in one of 2 ways. You can use this Apply button down here and click it, and you'll see that will actually apply the change and move the window. Or, suppose I wanted to change my mind and go back to 3 feet, I can simply move my mouse away from the palette. And programmers like to call this shifting focus. So if we shift our focus away from the Properties palette, that will automatically apply the change. Okay, so those are the 2 ways that we can apply one or more changes. The next part of the palette I want to point out to you is this little small drop down right here. Currently it says Windows with a quantity of 1. So Windows is the category of the object we have selected, Windows in this case, and I have 1 item selected. Now, we're going to talk about selection in an upcoming movie, but for right now, I'll just show you that if you use your Control key, and I'm going to come over here and use the Control key and select this second window, this bay window here, you can select an additional object, more than 1 object at a time. And what we'll see here is it still says Windows because both of those items share the same category, but now it says quantity 2. I have 2 windows selected. Now, up here on the Type selector, we see something a little different. It says multiple families selected. And that's because at the moment, the 2 objects I have selected are 2 different families. Now, we talked about the differences between category, family, and type in a previous movie. So if you'd like to, you could go back and review that now. But we've got two separate families selected here. And you want to be a little careful about this because if I changed it like to something dramatically different, 16 by 24 fixed window, you will see that that has a pretty dramatic impact on both of those windows. May or may not be the most architecturally exciting change to make, so perhaps I might want to undo that. I'm going to use my undo icon right here, or you can press Control-Z on your keyboard. Now I'm going to return to the level 1 floor plan and look at a few other examples of that concept that I just talked about. So again, here's a plumbing fixture family. I select it. It says plumbing fixtures here. It says plumbing fixtures here, and the quantity is 1. I can hold down my control key, select the second one, and again, I get multiple families because clearly a toilet and a bathtub are different from one another, so they are two different families, even though they share the same plumbing fixture category. Now, what would happen if you added a third or fourth item to the selection that was of a different category altogether? Well, now it's going to say multiple categories are selected here, and this changes to just say common. Now, what's interesting about this is you'll notice this is a drop-down menu. So you can actually open that up, and in addition to common with a quantity of 3, you'll see that that selection actually contains 2 plumbing fixtures and 1 wall. Now, it also says floor plan level 1 down there. So you will always have the current view listed at the bottom of that list because the view itself, the floor plan in this case, also has properties. So by choosing an item here off the list, I could edit the walls properties and change the kind of wall, make that a generic wall. I could choose the plumbing fixture properties, change something about those, or I could go to the floor plans properties and change something about the floor plan itself. Maybe I want to change the scale of the floor plan or the level of detail that it displays. So the properties is a multifaceted interface item that has many, many settings that we can interact with. And the key to using it successfully is to pay close attention to these subtle little nuances in its behavior. So in some cases, when you make a multiple selection, like perhaps I select this interior wall and then maybe this wall that we drew a few moments ago, what you'll see is that up here, it still says that we've got basic walls. There's more than one type selected. In addition, some of these properties over here look a little bizarre, like particularly the top constraint here. It actually has blanked out, implying that there's no setting. What's really important here is I want you to understand is that that actually doesn't mean necessarily that there's no setting. What it actually means is that there's more than one setting. So if you're not careful here, if you went in here and made some change, like suppose I said up to level 3, the impact of that change might actually be somewhat dramatic if we switch to another view, because now I have just changed the height of both of those walls, may or may not be what I had intended. So you need to pay close attention to not only what you have selected, but the subtle little clues that the properties palette is giving you there in order to be successful in your edits.